He was fired. Simple words, right? But the silence that followed those three words was the loudest thing I had ever heard in my entire life. Imagine standing in a ballroom draped in gold silk, the scent of $500 lilies heavy in the air, and watching the man you spent a decade of your life with, the man who shared your bed and your secrets, raising a crystal glass of champagne to another woman. That was my Tuesday night. My husband, Julian, looked like the king of Atlanta. He was polished, tanned, and wearing a tuxedo that cost more than most people's cars. A tuxedo, by the way, that I had paid for with my own secret dividends. He thought he was the architect of his own empire. He thought I was just the quiet wife at table 12 who didn't understand the difference between a gross margin and a grocery list. He leaned in close to Chloe, his 24-year-old marketing director, whose dress was so tight it looked like a second skin, and whispered something that made her giggle. He didn't see me standing by the stage. He didn't see the heavy black folder I was gripping until my knuckles turned white, and he certainly didn't realize that the microphone in my hand was live. My name is Madison. I'm 32 years old. 3 weeks ago, I was the woman the city of Atlanta pitied. I was the invisible wife of Julian Stone, the real estate mogul. People would whisper behind my back at charity galas, wondering how a plain girl like me managed to land a man like him. They didn't know that every office building he bought, every deal he closed, and every cent of the $10 million Stonegate Realty was worth was there because I allowed it. I wasn't just his wife. I was his boss. I was the sole owner of Vance Global, the private holding company that funded his entire existence. Tonight, the high society crowd was here to celebrate Stonegate's anniversary, but they were about to witness a liquidation instead. Julian had spent the last year treating me like furniture, useful but unremarkable, while secretly funneling $500,000 of my company's money into a private penthouse for Chloe. He thought he was playing a game of chess with a pawn, but he was actually playing against the queen. In exactly 3 minutes, I was going to use that power to turn his world into a pile of ash in front of 600 of his most important business partners. Before I take you to the moment I stripped him of his title, reputation, and dignity, let me show you how a man loses his soul for $500,000 of someone else's money. It starts with a lie and ends with a signature he never saw coming. I know what you're thinking. How could I let it go that far? Why stay silent while my life's work was being drained to pay for another woman's jewelry and a penthouse I didn't even know existed? It's easy to judge from the outside, but when you're in the middle of a marriage you thought was real, you sometimes have to become a ghost to see the truth. Before I show you the receipts, the legal traps, and the absolute look of terror on Julian's face when he realized he was unemployed, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe. It helps us keep telling these stories of truth and justice. Also, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one of them. Now, let's go back to the beginning, to the day the lies started. Madison and I met 6 years ago in Austin. I was 26, freshly minted as a millionaire after selling my first software platform. I had more money than I knew what to do with, but I was also terrified of being a target. I'd seen too many women in my circle get hunted by men who loved the zeros in their bank accounts more than the person behind them. My mother, a woman who had lived through her own share of financial battles, gave me one piece of advice that became my North Star. Madison, let them think you have nothing, and they will show you exactly who they are. It was the cheapest advantage I would ever get. When Julian walked up to me at that conference, he didn't see a CEO. He saw a girl in a simple cotton dress who looked a little overwhelmed by the crowd. He was charming, tall, and had that effortless Atlanta confidence that makes you feel like everything is going to be all right. He told me he was a struggling real estate agent with big dreams. I told him I had a modest inheritance and a passion for helping out. We fell in love, or at least I fell in love with the man I thought he was. When we got married and moved to Atlanta, I decided to keep the facade going. I created Vance Global, a private holding company, and used it to funnel my capital. I didn't just give Julian money, I made sure his business, Stonegate Realty, had the best contracts, the lowest interest rates, and the most prestigious clients. I did it all from the shadows, through shell companies and legal intermediaries. I wanted to build a legacy for us. I wanted to see him fly. But as Stonegate grew from a three-person office to a $10 million powerhouse, Julian changed. The man who used to bring me wildflowers from the side of the road was replaced by a man who only cared about the label on his watch. He started looking at me differently. To him, I wasn't the woman who had helped build his world. I was the weight holding him back from a higher social circle. His mother, Beatrice Stone, was the worst. She was a woman who smelled like Chanel No. 5 and old money judgment. At every family dinner, she'd make sure to mention my simple background. It's so refreshing that Julian married someone so grounded, she'd say, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension that makes your skin crawl. Not every man needs a wife with a career. Someone has to keep the house smelling like lavender, right, Madison? Julian would just laugh. It wasn't a mean laugh at first, but over time it became a dismissive one. He started calling me his clueless Maddie. He'd talk over me at parties, explaining real estate trends to people who I had secretly authorized loans for the week before. I'd sit there in my beige dresses. Beatrice had told me early on that loud colors are for people trying too hard, and I'd smile. I'd nod. I'd refill the wine glasses. One night, about a year ago, we were hosting a dinner for some potential investors. These were men I knew personally through Vance Global, but they had no idea I was Mrs. Stone. I heard Julian in the kitchen talking to his father. He's a great girl, Dad, but she just doesn't get the game. She's happy with her gardening and her volunteer work. I have to do all the heavy lifting. I felt a sharp pang in my chest. Heavy lifting? I was the one who had negotiated the mezzanine financing for his latest high-rise through my lawyers while he was at the golf course. But I didn't say a word. I went back to the table and served the roast. The more successful Julian felt, the more he pushed me into the background. He'd buy himself $3,000 suits and tell me I should save on my wardrobe because we need to be careful with the company's future. He didn't realize the irony. He was spending my money to look like he didn't need me. I started to realize that my mother was right. By pretending to have nothing, I had given Julian the perfect stage to show his true character. And he was failing. He didn't want a partner. He wanted a subordinate. He wanted someone he could look down on so he could feel tall. I was beginning to see the man behind the Southern gentleman mask, and he was smaller than I ever imagined. Beatrice once gifted me a home management book for our anniversary. Since you don't have the stress of a real job, darling, I thought you could master the art of the perfect pantry. Julian actually clapped. "That's my girl," he said, "the CEO of the Stone household." He thought it was a compliment. He really believed that my world began and ended at our front door. Every time he came home and saw me in my beige life, he felt more like a titan. He didn't know that every quarterly report he bragged about was a document I had already dissected and approved. He was living in a playground I had built for him, and he was starting to treat the owner like a trespasser. I still wanted to believe that if things got tough, he would stand by me. I didn't know that while I was protecting our future, he was already busy spending it on someone else. The truth didn't arrive with a dramatic scream or a tearful confession. It arrived as a cold, sterile PDF file on a Tuesday morning while Julian was in the shower, whistling a tune I didn't recognize. As the secret owner of Vance Global, I received quarterly internal audits of every business we backed. Stonegate Realty was supposed to be the crown jewel of our portfolio, but this time, something was rotting at the center of it all. I sat at my kitchen island, a cup of herbal tea steaming beside me, and opened the business development expenditure report. My eyes stopped at a single line item, $512,480. It was categorized as consulting and strategic outreach. For a company of Stonegate's size, that wasn't just a high number, it was a red flag the size of a billboard. My accountant's brain kicked in before my wife's heart could even realize it was under attack. I knew Julian's expansion plans. There were no consultants hired for $500,000. I pulled up the secondary ledger, the one Julian thought only his loyal CFO could see. I logged in using the administrative backdoor I had built into the system years ago. I remember my fingers were steady, but the air in the room suddenly felt very thin. I started to trace the wires. The first one was for $45,000, paid out to a high-end jeweler in Manhattan. The memo read, "Client gift." I felt a bitter laugh bubble up in my throat. I had been married to Julian for 6 years, and the most expensive piece of jewelry he'd ever bought me was a $200 silver locket for our third anniversary, claiming we needed to reinvest every penny into the firm's growth. Then came the monthly payments, $12,500 every single month for a luxury penthouse in Buckhead. I knew that building. It was where the city's elite kept their secrets. The lease wasn't under Stonegate's name. It was under a shell corporation called Azure Skies LLC. I spent the next 3 hours in a fugue state, digging deeper than any auditor would ever dare. I found the $250,000 consulting fee paid directly to Azure Skies. When I looked up the registration for that shell company, I didn't find an office or a board of directors. I found one name, Chloe Lawson. Julian walked into the kitchen then, smelling of expensive sandalwood soap and arrogance. He leaned over and kissed the top of my head, never even glancing at my laptop screen. "Still looking at those volunteer schedules, Maddie? You really should take a break. You're going to give yourself a headache over things that don't even matter." "Just making sure everyone is where they're supposed to be, Julian," I said, my voice as flat as the horizon. "That's my girl. Listen, I have a late board meeting tonight. Don't wait up. We're closing a massive deal with the Vans people, and I need to be at the top of my game." I watched him walk out the door, his $3,000 suit fitting him like armor. He thought he was going to a meeting to secure his future. He didn't realize he was going to a dinner I had already authorized, using money he was stealing from me to impress a woman he thought I didn't know about. As the door clicked shut, I didn't cry. I didn't throw my tea across the room. I remembered what my mother told me from her hospital bed all those years ago. "Madison, memory is a liability if you don't document it. Don't be the woman who screams, be the woman who keeps the receipts." I opened a new folder on my encrypted drive. I labeled it Inventory. I began to catalog the betrayal with the precision of a surgeon. I didn't just save the wire transfers, I cross-referenced them with Julian's business trips. Every time he told me he was in Chicago for a conference, I found a hotel bill for 2 in Miami. Every time he missed my birthday or our anniversary because of a crisis at a construction site, I found a receipt for a $2,000 dinner at a steakhouse 5 blocks from our house. He was using my company's capital to fund a secret life for his mistress. He was literally buying her a lifestyle using the money I had worked for years to build. Chloe Lawson didn't know that every designer bag Julian bought her was technically a gift from me. She didn't know that the bed she slept in was paid for by a clueless housewife she mocked over cocktails. The total was staggering, $512,000. That was the price he put on our marriage. That was the value of my trust. For $500,000, he was willing to erase me. I sat in the silence of our 5-bedroom house, a house that felt like a museum of a life I no longer recognized, and I made a choice. I could have called my lawyers right then. I could have frozen the accounts and locked him out by sunset, but that would have been too quick. Julian loved the spotlight. He loved being the golden boy of Atlanta real estate. If I was going to take him down, I wasn't just going to take his money. I was going to take his stage. I looked at the photograph of my mother on the wall. She was laughing in that photo, wearing her old yellow raincoat, looking like a woman who knew exactly who she was. "Let them underestimate you, kiddo," her voice echoed in my mind. "It's the cheapest advantage you'll ever get." Julian thought he had already won. He thought he had successfully moved his simple wife to the sidelines while he built a new kingdom with a new queen. He had no idea that I was the one who owned the land his kingdom was built on. He was standing on a trap door, and I was the only one with the key. I closed my laptop and did something I hadn't done in weeks. I smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a predator who had just finished mapping the terrain. I was going to be the perfect, quiet, beige-wearing wife for a little while longer. I was going to give him enough rope to tie his own noose, and I was going to make sure the whole city was watching when he finally stepped off the edge. For the next 2 months, I gave the performance of a lifetime. If there were an Oscar for most convincing housewife in supporting role, I would have swept the category. Every morning, I woke up at 6 a.m., made Julian's favorite organic dark roast coffee, and laid out his silk ties. I played the part of the devoted, slightly dim-witted Madison so perfectly that even Julian, a man who prided himself on reading people, didn't suspect a thing. Maddie, I'm thinking of taking the firm public next year, he said one morning over a plate of perfectly poached eggs. He didn't look at me, he was too busy admiring his own reflection in the polished silver toaster. It's going to be a legacy. The Stone name will be everywhere in Georgia. You should start looking for a bigger house, maybe something in Tuxedo Park. You'll need more room for your little gardening projects. That sounds wonderful, Julian, I said, my voice soft, compliant. You've worked so hard for us. I have, he sighed, leaning back with a smug grin. It's a lot of pressure being the only one in this house who understands how the world works. But hey, that's why I married a girl like you. You're easy, Maddie. No drama, no complicated opinions. Just there. I gripped my coffee mug under the table. Just there. For years, he had confused my peace for passivity. He had mistaken my silence for a lack of substance. But while he was busy dreaming of a legacy built on my stolen capital, I was spending my afternoons in a high-rise office downtown that he didn't even know existed. I traded my beige housewife sweaters for sharp, tailored power suits the second he left the driveway. I spent my days with my legal team at Vance Global, led by a man named Arthur Sterling, who had been my father's most trusted advisor before he passed. Madison, we have everything, Sterling said, sliding a thick leather portfolio across the mahogany desk. The forensic audit is complete. We've traced the $512,480 directly to Azure Skies LLC. We have the lease agreement for the penthouse signed by Julian. We even have the credit card receipts for the Tiffany necklaces and the designer handbags he's been buying for Chloe Lawson. And the company, I asked, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the Atlanta skyline. Stonegate Realty is technically solvent, only because Vance Global is its primary creditor. Julian signed a senior lending facility 3 years ago, Section 14, subsection C, the fiduciary breach clause. It states that if the CEO engaged in financial fraud or used company funds for non-business purposes, the lender has the right to accelerate the debt and terminate the CEO's employment immediately. He didn't read it, did he? I whispered. Sterling chuckled, a dry, paper-thin sound. He saw the check for $10 million and signed the signature page. Men like Julian never read the fine print, Madison. They're too busy looking at the size of the font on the check. Good, I said. I want the default notice ready for the night of the gala, not a second before. Playing the quiet wife meant I had to endure Julian's mother, Eleanor, as well. She visited a week before the gala, bringing a dress she had chosen for me. It was a pale, washed-out champagne color. It's very neutral, Eleanor said, looking at me as if I were a smudge on her glasses. Julian is the star of the show, Madison. We wouldn't want you wearing anything that might distract from his speech. You're the background, dear. Always remember that. I looked at the dress. It was the color of a woman who had given up. It's perfect, Eleanor. Thank you. Inside, I was screaming. I was a woman who built a software empire at 25. I was a woman who managed more assets in a week than Julian handled in a year. But I let her believe she was superior. I let Julian believe he was a titan. I even had to endure Chloe. She started calling the house, pretending to be a concerned assistant. Hi, Madison, it's Chloe from the office. Julian left his briefcase again. He's so busy, you know. He really needs someone who can keep up with him. I'm sure he does, Chloe, I said, my heart cold. Thank you for looking after him. Julian grew bolder. He stopped hiding the scent of her perfume on his collars. He stopped making excuses for his late nights. He thought he had successfully moved me to a corner of his life where I no longer mattered. I was so convinced of his weakness that he didn't realize I was the one holding the remote to his entire reality. The night before the gala, I sat in our bedroom watching him pack his things for an overnight trip he was taking immediately after the event. He told me it was an investor retreat. I knew it was a celebratory weekend in Savannah with Chloe. "You're going to be so proud of me tomorrow, Maddie," he said, zipping his bag. "Everything is changing, for both of us." "I know it is, Julian," I replied, standing by the window. "I can feel it." He didn't even notice the change in my tone. He was too busy rehearsing his victory lap. He had no idea that the housewife he was planning to leave behind had already purchased the debt of his soul. I wasn't just his wife anymore. I was the storm he had invited into his house, and tomorrow night the clouds were finally going to break. The St. Regis ballroom was a sea of black ties, shimmering silk gowns, and the kind of expensive laughter that only happens when people think they're on the winning side of a deal. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and the metallic tang of chilled champagne. Julian was at the center of it all, his $5,000 tuxedo fitting him like a second skin, his face glowing under the crystal chandeliers. He looked like the king of Atlanta, and for the last 10 years, I had been the silent architect of his throne. I arrived late. I wore the beige dress Eleanor had chosen for me, the one meant to make me invisible. I kept my mother's small pearl earrings on, a quiet reminder of the woman who taught me that the biggest moves are made in the shadows. As I walked through the double mahogany doors, no one turned their head. I was just the quiet wife, the background noise to Julian's grand symphony. I found my seat at table 1. Julian was already standing, a microphone in one hand and a flute of vintage Krug in the other. Chloe was sitting right next to his chair, wearing a red dress that looked like a scream in a room full of whispers. She didn't even look at me when I sat down. She was too busy gazing up at Julian with the practiced adoration of a woman who thought she'd just inherited a kingdom. Friends, partners, and the visionaries who make Atlanta the heart of the South. Tonight isn't just about celebrating 10 years of Stonegate Realty. It's about the next 50. It's about grit. It's about leadership. And most importantly, it's about the people who have the courage to build something out of nothing. He paused, letting the silence build, milking the moment. "You all know me. You know I don't play it safe. But even a man like me needs a team that matches his ambition. I'd like to acknowledge someone tonight who has been instrumental in our recent expansion." He looked down at Chloe. The room followed his gaze. "Chloe Lawson has been more than a marketing director. She is the future of this firm's outreach. She understands where we are going." The applause was polite but pointed. I watched the faces at the neighboring tables, the bankers from Wells Fargo, the board members I had secretly vetted years ago. They were looking at Chloe, then at me, then back at Julian. They could smell the scandal, but they were waiting to see if it was authorized. Julian didn't mention my name once. Not as a wife, not as a partner, not even as an ornament. It was as if I didn't exist in the world I had funded. He was busy raising his glass to his new chapter, while the woman he was paying for sat in my rightful place. I felt the weight of the black folder in my lap. Inside were the forensic audits, the wire transfers to Azure Skies LLC, and the default notice that would effectively end his career before the dessert course was served. I looked at Julian's father, Robert, who was chuckling and nodding at his son. He'd once told Julian that marrying me was marrying down, that I was just a girl from a simple family who should be grateful for the Stone name. "And now," Julian continued, his voice dripping with arrogance, "I'd like to invite our representative from Vance Global to the stage. As you all know, Vance Global is our primary senior lender. Without their $10 million facility, the new Buckhead development wouldn't be possible. They've asked to remain anonymous for years, but tonight they've agreed to sign the final expansion contracts publicly." This was it. The trap was set, and Julian had walked into the center of it with a smile on his face. I stood up. The chair scraped against the marble floor, a sharp, ugly sound in the middle of his polished speech. Julian's eyes flickered toward me. His smile didn't reach his eyes. It was a warning. "Maddie, not now," he hissed, the microphone still live but held at his waist. "Sit down, you're embarrassing me." "I'm not embarrassing you, Julian. I'm just doing my job." The ballroom went cold. The string quartet stopped playing mid-note. I walked up the stairs, my heels clicking a rhythm of absolute certainty. Julian tried to step in front of the podium, his face flushing a deep, angry purple. "Madison, I mean it. Get back to your seat. You've had too much champagne. Someone get her a car." "I haven't had a drop of drink, Julian," I said, stepping past him to the microphone. I looked out at the 600 people in that room. My name is Madison Stone, but to the board of directors and the legal department at Stonegate Realty, I am known as the sole managing member of Vance Global. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was a vacuum. You could hear the collective gasp from the back of the room. The board chair, a man I had worked with for 3 years under a pseudonym, stood up slowly. Julian laughed. It was a high, panicked sound. "She's delusional, my wife. She's a stay-at-home gardener. She doesn't even know how to read a balance sheet. Everyone, please ignore this. It's a family matter." Section 14, subsection C of the Senior Lending Agreement, Julian. I opened the black folder on the podium for everyone to see. In the fiduciary breach clause, you signed it 3 years ago on page 47. You were so busy looking at the $10 million check that you didn't bother to read the part where I, as the lender, reserved the right to audit your personal expenditures if they were leveraged against company assets. I turned the folder toward the front row where the press was sitting. In the last 12 months, Julian Stone has diverted $512,480 in corporate capital to fund a shell company called Azure Skies LLC. That money wasn't for business development, it was for a penthouse in Buckhead and a lifestyle for Miss Chloe Lawson. Chloe went from smug to ghostly in 3 seconds. She tried to stand, but the weight of the room's judgment seemed to pin her to her chair. Julian grabbed my arm, his grip hard enough to bruise. "You're lying. You can't prove any of this. You're a housewife, Madison. You're nothing." "I'm the person who owns your debt, Julian," I whispered, loud enough for the microphone to catch. "And as of 9:14 p.m. tonight, Vance Global is calling in the entire $10 million loan. Since you've breached the morality and fiduciary clauses, your equity is forfeited and your employment as CEO is terminated. Gregory," I looked at my lawyer in the front row, "please serve the board with the formal notice of default." Julian looked around the room, searching for an ally. He looked at his father, but Robert was staring at the floor. He looked at his partners, but they were already turning their backs to him, terrified of the legal firestorm I had just unleashed. He was standing in the middle of a $1 million party, surrounded by people who had spent years calling me simple and clueless, and he realized he was the only person in the room who truly had nothing. "You're fired, Julian," I said, my voice like ice. "Get off my stage."
We are at the absolute turning point of Madison's life. Watching that smug look disappear from Julian's face was the most satisfying moment I've ever experienced. If you are feeling that same rush of justice right now, I want you to do something for me. Drop a justice emoji or just type the word free in the comments below. I want to see who's still with me as the walls finally close in on him. And if you're new here and you believe that no one should ever be made to feel small in their own home, hit that subscribe button right now. Your support is why we can keep exposing the truth and bringing these stories of strength to light. We're not done yet. Julian is still standing on that stage, and I'm about to deliver the final blow. Let's watch the king fall. The fallout was swifter and more brutal than I had ever imagined. In the high-stakes world of Atlanta business, your reputation is the only currency that matters, and Julian had just been declared bankrupt in front of every major creditor in the city. The silence in the ballroom after my announcement was the last time Julian was ever the center of attention in a room like that. Within 48 hours, the Golden Boy was a ghost. Vance Global moved with surgical precision. We didn't just fire him, we exercised the right to liquidate every asset tied to the fiduciary breach. The $10 million empire he thought he owned was revealed for what it was, a house of cards built on my secret capital. The Porsche he loved so much was repossessed from our driveway at 3 in the morning while he stood on the lawn in his robe, screaming at a man who was just doing his job. The Buckhead penthouse? Chloe was served an eviction notice before the sun came up the next morning. And as for Chloe, she didn't stick around to fight for love. The second she realized Julian didn't have the keys to the vault anymore, she was gone. I heard through the office grapevine that she called her father to beg him for money, leaving Julian in a mountain of legal debt and a reputation so shattered that even a fast food joint would hesitate to hire him. He went from CEO to living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the wrong side of the city, working as a commission-only junior agent for a firm that doesn't even know his name. But the most satisfying part wasn't the money. It was the freedom. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, found herself socially exiled. The women's clubs and charity boards that used to fawn over her suddenly had no vacancies. She had spent years making me feel like a smudge on her glasses, but now the Stone name was synonymous with fraud, and she had to face the very society she'd tried to keep me out of. As for me, I didn't just take the money and run. I rebranded Vance Global, and in the heart of downtown, I opened the Vance Resilience Center. It's a place for women who have been financially abused, women who were told they were just housewives and were left with nothing. We provide legal aid, financial training, and a safe space to rebuild. Every morning, I walk into my office, no longer wearing beige, no longer hiding my strength. I look at a photo of my mother on my desk, and I smile. She was right. Letting them underestimate me was the cheapest advantage I ever got, but the real prize was finding the woman I was always meant to be. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of Madison's journey. This story is more than just about a failed marriage or a secret fortune. It's a reminder that your worth is never defined by the labels people try to force upon you. If you've ever been the quiet one at the table, just know that your silence isn't weakness, it's your strategy. Julian thought he could price my value like a piece of inventory, but he learned the hard way that integrity isn't for sale. If this story gave you chills or inspired you to hold your line, please hit that like button and subscribe to join our community. I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had to find the courage to speak your truth in a room full of lies? I read every single response. Until next time, stay strong and stay observant.